Good evening. Welcome. I am Dr. Margot Hurlbert. I am a jointly appointed member of the Faculty of Arts in the Department of Justice Studies and the Department of Sociology and Social Studies. And first of all, I would like to bring greetings on behalf of President Timmins, who can't be here tonight. My first task, though, as the introducer, is to acknowledge Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories where this lecture is taking place, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. So I would like to welcome you here to the fifth lecture of the Deliberation and Debate. This is a series that has run since last year. Other lecturers who have attended the University of Regina to deliver lectures, such as this one, are Dr. Marie Batiste, who came and spoke on indigenization, Dr. Jennifer Freed, who spoke on sexual assault and institutional betrayal, Dr. Christopher Reagan, who spoke on carbon pricing, and Caleb Ben, who spoke on oil and gas exploration on indigenous territory. So just a little background on the Deliberation and Debate lecture series and how it came about. There was concern about free speech and academic freedom on campus. So President Timmins wanted to see open and frank debate for several reasons. She started this series. One is it's the hallmark of a university. President Timmins does not want to lead a university where academic freedom and freedom of speech does not take place. There were worries about political correctness and its stifling of debate, but at the same time, President Timmins was also worried that debate and dialogue were becoming less civil in the world. So we had an incident with Bill Watcott coming to the university and distributing information that we found objectionable. So everyone should have the opportunity to participate in respectful debates on sensitive and important topics. So a quote from Jesse Jackson got her thinking. The quote is, "Deliberation and debate is the way you stir the soul of our democracy." So that quote embodies everything universities stand for and seemed like a great name for a lecture series. So her idea was to pilot this series by forming a committee and taking suggestions from our university community on what would be a good topic and who would be a good lecturer. So thankfully, the Faculty of Arts proposed the lecture we have here tonight with Dr. Saad. So his lecture has been in the works for a long time. It was approved by the committee in January, but scheduling only allowed it to take place for now. The committee considered carefully this application with all other submissions. The criteria was, the lecture was to have something that would be based in scholarship and generate discussion. We also have a lecture coming up on September 25th with Dennis Edney, Omar Khadr's lawyer, and we encourage you to attend. So I'm sure these lectures and discussions will be worth the wait. In closing, we don't always agree with each other, but we should agree on our right to express our views in a civil manner. We would like to see challenging and respectful discussions. This has been our tradition and it must continue, so tonight is a great way to do that. So I am looking forward to hearing Dr. Saad and to hearing from you in our question and answer sessions. Thank you for participating.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Rick Clear. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Regina. It's my happy task tonight to introduce our speaker to you. I'll start with the formalities and we'll get to the more interesting pieces later in my introduction. Dr. Saad holds an MSc and a PhD from Cornell University. Currently, he is Professor of Marketing and Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption. Do you use that label, Dr. Saad, every time you introduce yourself? It's a long one. Okay. He is the author of over 75 scientific publications in the areas of marketing, consumer behavior, psychology, economics, evolutionary theory, Medicine and Bibliometrics. His work has appeared in such outlets as the Journal of Marketing Research, the Journal of Consumer Psychology, the Journal of Neuroscience, Psychology and Economics, and the Journal of Social Psychology. He's also the author of several prominent books. Here's a title that you'll find interesting, I hope: The Consuming Instinct: What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift-Giving Reveal About Human Nature. That book has since been translated into Korean and Turkish. Don't know what that says. Another book, The Evolutionary Bases of Consumption, published in 2007, was the first academic book to demonstrate the Darwinian roots of a wide range of consumption phenomena. He was also the recipient of the 2014 Darwinism Applied Award, which is granted by the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society. Many of you, however, are more likely to know Dr. Saad as a very popular Psychology Today blogger, or from his YouTube channel, The Sad Truth. His Psychology Today blog posts have garnered over 4.4 million views. Now, I took this from his website a little while ago. He tells me that his audience is growing exponentially, so it might be a larger number by now. His YouTube channel also has 89,000 subscribers and over 7.1 million views. No doubt this is why he received the 2015 Concordia University President's Media Outreach Award. With his blog and on his YouTube channel, he has been a strong critic of political correctness, which he argues has stifled debate on university campuses. His views on the subject have sparked both admiration and outrage. Whether we disagree or agree with his position, I trust his lecture tonight will be challenging and thought-provoking. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Saad.
Hello, everybody. I just want to make sure that it's okay. So first, I wanted to thank you all for coming, and of course, thank the University of Regina for doing the unthinkable today, which is to invite people who might actually challenge our preconceived ideas. What a strange idea in today's intellectual landscape. So thank you to the folks at the University of Regina, and thank you to all those who are here. You'll find out by today's talk that no, I'm not a Jewish Nazi. By the way, much of today's talk, not all of it, but about, I'd say at least 80, 90% of it, is a talk that I gave when I addressed the Parliament. Not the Canadian Senate testimony, but later that day, I had addressed the Parliament. And politicians are also politically correct folks, and it went off famously well, so hopefully it will go as well here. So this is regrettably the ethos that drives much of our conversations today. We condemn freedom of speech that hurts other people's feelings. No. Freedom of speech is precisely there, not to tell me that I have beautiful green eyes, but to challenge me, to say things. As I said, in many cases, I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew their nonsense. And I'm Jewish, and I support their right to say that the Holocaust never happened. So I walk the walk and I talk the talk. Right? So we have to support freedom of speech if we are to grow and learn. Here's another great one. I will beat you with my tolerance placard. For those of you, well, before I go on to the next one, I just want to read to you a few incredible quotes. This is in a paper that was published by Edward. It's titled, "I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me." Let me just read you a few quotes from it. "I have intentionally adjusted my teaching material as the political winds have shifted. Most of my colleagues who still have jobs have done the same. That should not make any of us happy. Hurting a student's feelings, even in the course of instruction that is absolutely appropriate and respectful, can now get a teacher into serious trouble. In this type of environment, boat rocking isn't just dangerous, it's suicidal. And so teachers limit their lessons to things they know won't upset anybody. This shift in student-teacher dynamic placed many of the traditional goals of higher education, such as having students challenge their beliefs, off limits. So it's not just that students refuse to countenance uncomfortable ideas, they refuse to engage them, period. This is a very liberal professor writing this. For those of you who don't know, on August 22nd of this year, I was scheduled to speak at Ryerson University. The title of the event was "The Stifling of Free Speech on University Campus." Guess what happened to that event? The irony of the Antifa terrorists was lost on them. It turns out, maybe you can't read all this stuff, but I was accused. For those of you who don't know, I'm from Lebanon. As I said, I'm Jewish. I was accused of being a white supremacist, anti-Semitic Nazi. So when people have so lost the plot that they can levy that accusation, then you might want to wonder whether they're on the right side of these issues. So today what I'll do is really a hodgepodge of examples stemming from what I call death of the West by 1,000 cuts. What that refers to is that there are all sorts of faux intellectual movements that have caused us to depart from reason, from our commitment to logic, to science, to evidentiary thresholds. Now, none of these movements in of themselves are fatal, but put them all together and you have a perfect tsunami of lunacy, of anti-science thinking, of anti-reason, of rejection of reason. And so what I'll be doing is giving examples, I think poignant examples, of each of these manifestations. The point is not to be provocative for the sake of being provocative. It's not to hurt anybody's feelings. Not that I should have to preface it by this, but it's to basically implore all of you to commit to reason. Let reason, let science, let logic dictate your positions rather than political tribalism. Belong to the tribe of truth, not to the left, not to the right, not to the center. Just be committed to pursuing the truth as best as you can. So let's start with an example. This is an example that has since become sort of a cult, infamous example. It stems from a conversation I had back in 2002. I had been invited by my doctoral student who had just defended his dissertation to go on a celebratory dinner with him, with my wife, and with his date for the evening. He had warned me that his date had the perfect cocktail of markers. She was a radical feminist, a cultural anthropologist, and a postmodernist. Uh-oh. So he asked me, please, let's have a good time. I said, Scott's honor, I will be on my best behavior. No, not true. So halfway through the dinner, I said to the lady, so I hear you're a postmodernist. Yes, I am. I said, okay, well, postmodernism suggests that there are no objective truths other than the one objective truth, that there are no objective truths. Do you mind if I offer you some human universals that I think are human universals and hence objectively true? Because as an evolutionary psychologist, I do study cross-cultural similarities and cross-cultural differences. So do you mind if I suggest some human universals and then you could tell me how I'm doing it the wrong way? She goes, absolutely. I said, is it true that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? Is that a universal? She looked at me with disgust, with derision at my simpleton mind and said, absolutely not. I said, no, how is that? She said, well, there is a tribe off some island in Japan where within the spiritual realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the definition of childbearing to the material biological realm, this is how you keep us pregnant and barefoot. So after I recovered from my partial stroke, I said, okay, I guess it's maybe too controversial to argue that only women bear children. Let's take a less controversial case. Is it true that from any vantage point on Earth, the following cosmological statement holds? Since time immemorial, sailors have relied on the fact that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And this is why now we have here a dancing hyena. So here she used something called deconstructionism. She said, I don't buy your labels of east and west. I don't buy your label sun. What you call sun, I call dancing hyena. To which I answered, fine. The dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. When I go to a Caribbean vacation, I put dancing hyena lotion on my stomach. She said, I will not play this game. I don't play labels. Now this was in a sense prescient, because we've since learned that men can bear children. You just have to be a woman who self-identifies as a man, and then it is true that men bear children. This is not a slight on transgender people. That's not a slight on the fact that transgender people have every right to live with full dignity, fully protected under the law. But is it really the case that we're going to now alter all our biology texts to argue that sometimes it is men who bear children, sometimes it is women who bear children? Which leads us to the next example. Trigger warning, trigger warning. This is not an image from me. This is from a Huffington Post article. So if you have a queasy stomach, please turn away. Powerful photo shows that women aren't the only ones who menstruate. Men menstruate too. And by what we mean by men is simply women who identify as men. So for example, I published a paper in one of the leading journals in my field, Journal of Consumer Psychology, rated A, if not A+, where I looked with one of my doctoral students at how the ovulatory cycle affects women's behaviors. For example, we found that women dress the most provocatively when they are in the maximally fertile phase of their menstrual cycle, which is exactly what you would expect from an evolutionary perspective, because we know that that's when sexual signaling is most adaptive to engage in. So now is that paper no longer valid because we actually restricted our study? We sampled only women. We didn't sample women who identify as men. Maybe we were being transphobic. Right? So the idea is that we could all strive for social justice, and I'm about as liberal as they come on these issues, but I don't injure the truth. I don't kill the truth in the pursuit of social justice. I'm still committed to being a strong adherent of the truth while also making sure that transgender people or gay people or brown people or purple people are protected. It's not an either or. We don't have to give up the truth to engage in social justice. This is actually something on the right-hand side that I discussed during my Canadian Senate testimony when I was asked to weigh in on some of the issues regarding Bill C-16. Again, I fully support the right of the transgender folks to live free of any bigotry. What I was arguing in that Canadian Senate testimony is that the language was sufficiently vague that anything that I taught in my evolutionary psychology course could be considered transphobic systemic violence. That's in quotes. Harvard University has argued that one's gender identity and gender expression could change on a daily basis. So Monday, I'm a man. Tuesday, I'm a woman. Wednesday, I'm non-gendered. Thursday, I'm non-binary. Friday, I'm back to being man. And they argued that to promulgate fixed binaries and biological essentialism. Fixed binaries means you say something like, there are sex differences between men and women. So stating that and offering a biological evolutionary reason for that, also called biology, that is transphobic systemic violence. It's not metaphorical. It's not allegorical. You stating that there are evolved sex differences is a form of transphobic violence. Is that really logical? Is that really something that we want to have? So maybe I should stop teaching my course in evolution, because everything I say is transphobic systemic violence. By the way, check out this really transphobic guy. The guy who is, with the black hair is me in 1992, 1993 at the Rio Carnival. Oh, gay and trans parade. So for a guy who is transphobic, I have a really weird way of showing it. Okay? So again, my interventions are never about attacking individuals. It's about attacking ideas that are contrary to human dignity and to truth. That's all I care about. Here's another one of those. Remember, I put up a bunch of boxes with all the different movements that are anti-science. Social constructivism is one such movement within the social sciences. Social constructivism basically says that everything is due to a social construction. We're born with empty minds, it's tabula rasa, and it's only various socialization forces that make us who we become. So how do boys learn to be little boys and girls to be little girls? Well, it must be because boys are taught to play vigorously with trucks, and little girls are taught to play in a nurturing way with dolls. Many of you may know the book As Nature Made Him. This is David Reimer, who had the horrible accident through a botched circumcision. And so John Money, who was a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, who was one of the big theorists from gender theory, said, oh, there's no problem. As long as you put a dress on him, call him some girl name, and raise him as a girl, then that's what he'll be. What do you think happened to David Reimer? He committed suicide. Okay? And then here I just put another example. I put this example because the social constructivists will argue, oh, why are young males violent? Oh, it's because of rap videos. Oh, it's because of violent song lyrics. Yes, because before rap, there is no recorded history of men being violent towards each other. It's only with Sugar Hill Gang in 1978 that all hell broke loose. But until that point, men just walked around singing Kumbaya and John Lennon. Now, where does this kind of stupidity come from? Well, it comes actually from a very hopeful place, because it basically argues that we're all born undamaged, we're all born with empty minds, we're all born with equal potentiality. If only my parents had been more nurturing, I could have been the next NBA star, but that bastard Michael Jordan beat me to it, right? So there was absolutely no biological predisposition for him to be more likely to succeed than me as an NBA superstar. So this type of idiocy actually comes from a hopeful position, which is, hey, we're all born the same, and if we could only eradicate some environmental force, then we will all get along. But the fact that it's hopeful and nice doesn't mean that it's true, and it doesn't mean that we must promulgate it. And what I've been doing in my scientific work for well over 20 years is to argue that of course culture matters, of course the environment matters, of course socialization matters, but biology matters too. We are both a biological and a cultural animal. So we can't have in the social sciences whole fields that completely abdicate the idea that biology matters. Now, I navigate both in the natural sciences and the social sciences. I never get somebody in the natural sciences saying, gee, really? Humans are biological beings? Geez, I never knew that. But I have a long, long lineup of detractors in the social sciences are offended by this biology bullshit. Right? The biology works for the mosquito, you see. Biology works for the zebra, but don't you dare say that the same evolutionary mechanisms explain our behaviors. That's silly. No biologist thinks that. Let's talk very briefly about political correctness. I've analogized political correctness to the spider wasp's sting. Maybe some of you have seen me talk about this, maybe on my YouTube channel. The spider wasp does a very morbid thing. So you see him on the left, it's much, much smaller than the spider that it eventually stings. It stings it, rendering it zombified. I mean, literally zombified. And then it carries it on its own time down its burrow, where it lays its eggs on it, and then the offspring hatch, eat the spider in vivo while it's alive. Well, political correctness is exactly the spider's wasp. It injects our brain, it lulls us into a zombified state as we're slowly led to the abyss of infinite lunacy. And if we're going to break out of this, we need to be having the conversations like the one we're having here today, which is respectful discussion of ideas is never dangerous. Nothing that I will say today should cause any of you to feel threatened or you need to play with coloring books and doll houses and puppies. Nothing that I will say should trigger that reaction in you. If it does, then boy, you're lucky you didn't grow up in the childhood that I had in Lebanon, escaping my head being cut off from my head. That's triggering. Hearing me speak is not triggering. Let's look here at an example of political correctness gone completely haywire. On the left-hand side, I've taken the number of countries. Now, this needs to be updated. It's actually now greater. These are the number of countries that have been visited by some peaceful terror attacks. I'm being sarcastic. These countries vary in every possible meaningful way. They vary linguistically, economically, racially, religiously. Every possible way they vary. There is only one thing that they have in common. The perpetrators in those 67 countries, which, by the way, is more than 31,000 terror attacks since 9/11 alone. They have one thing in common, but no one dare say what this thing in common is. Okay, fine, I'll say it. It's the Janes. No, nobody got that? Okay. On the right-hand side, I've listed for you a partial list of what people have suggested is the cause of the terror attacks in those 67 countries. I won't list all of them, but I'll list some of the truly luminary ones. Beard bullying caused the attack. This is not satire. It wasn't on Saturday Night Live. Someone who is an otherwise smart person thought that beard bullying might be at play. Lack of art exposure. So you've got these young guys in the Brussels suburbs. I mean, they didn't get exposed to Chagall and Dali. Well, what do you expect them? Of course they're going to go to Raqqa to kill those Shia dogs. Because the only reason why I don't go there is because I haven't seen enough Dali paintings. Solar panels is the reason for it. The brilliant and luminary Bill Nye explained to us simpletons that it is perfectly reasonable to draw a direct causal link between the terror attack that happened in Bataclan in Paris a few years ago and climate change. So he linked that attack to solar panels and to carbon emission levels. He wasn't joking, he wasn't being facetious, he was being serious. That's what political correctness gets you. Now, that doesn't mean that if you draw a link between a religious ideology and all of these attacks, that you're marginalizing all people of that faith. Of course not. 99% of the people of that faith are undoubtedly perfectly lovely. But that doesn't mean that in the desire to be politically correct, we shouldn't also face realities. When I walk down a dark alley and I see 4 young guys, I've evolved the brain to think, on average, 4 young guys are statistically more likely to be dangerous to me than 4 elderly ladies. Now, when I do that, I'm not being an ageist. I'm not being a sexist. I'm recognizing that on average, young men are more dangerous than elderly women, even though most young men are perfectly lovely. Okay? Let's look at some few cases of utter lunacy. This is a UBC law professor, Lorna June McHugh, who went up for tenure. For those of you who don't know what tenure is an honor, a privilege that we bestow on professors because they've published enough, they've contributed to the pantheon of human knowledge sufficiently that they are now deemed worthy of receiving the institutional protections afforded by tenure. So that if I now say things that my dean doesn't like, he or she can't come and fire me because they don't like what I published. So tenure is a very important process of academic freedom. Now, this particular professor had not had a very productive career in terms of publishing. So she argued that given the fact that she comes from an indigenous culture with oral traditions, the onerous task of having her, write things and publish things was contrary to her culture. And this is now being heard in a human rights tribunal. I'll leave it for you to mull it over. Here's another case of lunacy where people try to find racism everywhere. The best way to cut debate is to just accuse somebody of being a racist, a homophobe, and a Nazi, and so on, right? But it usually comes from people who otherwise don't have any counter ideas to propose. So Anisa Rouhani ran an experiment at Queen's University. She donned the hijab for 18 days because she wanted to demonstrate that, Canadians are all a bunch of lunatic Islamophobes, and that hopefully she would be able to document that. At the end of the 18 days, she came to the conclusion that the people who interacted with her were unbelievably kind, sweet, tolerant, polite. So what did she conclude? Aha! That demonstrates how Islamophobic they are. Because they have such latent hatred, they are overcompensating by being super nice. So let's analyze this if any of you have taken Boolean logic. If I am mean and nasty to a woman wearing a hijab, I'm an Islamophobe. If I am kind and tolerant to a woman who's wearing a hijab, I'm an Islamophobe. All roads lead to me being an asshole. Solid logic, way to go. Here's another one. It turns out that to not rape is racist. You heard it. To not rape is racist. Let me explain it to you. This is an award-winning paper at Hebrew University in Jerusalem by the then doctoral student Tal Nitzan. She wanted to uncover incidences of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military, of the rampant epidemic of rapes of Palestinian women. And hopefully if she can uncover that, then we can go with the narrative that the IDF are a bunch of Nazis. Unfortunately, for the thesis, she couldn't uncover a single case of rape by the IDF on Palestinian women. What was the conclusion of her paper? I'm glad you're all sitting down. The IDF are so racist that they hated the Palestinian women so much that they wouldn't even rape them. I'm not joking. This is not satire. I'm not being facetious. So if she had found that they raped the women, they were hateful, horrifying people. And if none of them raped anybody, they were horrible, disgusting people. That's what happens when your brain is parasitized by tribal identity. That's what happens when your brain is not committed to just seeking the truth. Oh yeah, my main man. My man. I buckle when I see him. I can't control myself. He's so dashing. When he was a parliamentarian, Prime Minister Trudeau, well, before I do that, let me mention this. This was in the Harper government. They had put out a booklet to basically enunciate exactly their position regarding how immigrants should integrate within Canada. And in that spirit, so going against the idea of multiculturalism. By the way, multiculturalism has really two meanings. There's multiculturalism in a colloquial sense. So if I say, University of Regina is a multicultural campus, that means that there are people from many cultural backgrounds, and that's great, that's beautiful. But multiculturalism as a political philosophy has a different meaning. It basically says you don't have any onus placed on you to assimilate within the host's culture. You could, who are we to judge your cultural value? That's linked to cultural relativism. And that's not a good idea, because there are cultural practices that we can all agree are not good ones, that we don't want in our societies. So Harper's government, this is a quote, had put out a thing that says, Canada's openness and generosity do not extend to barbaric cultural practices that tolerate spousal abuse, honor killings, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, or other gender-based violence. Now, you would think anybody who's liberal in this room would say, yeah, I support that. I don't want child brides. I don't want female genital mutilation. Isn't that what the true liberal position is? But our main man, his reflex was to first get very upset that someone had referred to those cultural practices as barbaric. So he wasn't upset by the barbaric practices. He was upset that someone would use the appellation barbaric on those practices. Now, eventually, when there was blowback against him, he kind of walked it back. But the first response is the one that's telling, right? That's someone whose brain has been parasitized by cultural and moral relativism. Here's another example. This is Dr. Fwambe Ahmadu. She appeared on a show where she argued that it is racist to criticize female genital mutilation. And it's also sexist because we should have gender egalitarian surgeries. So boys are getting circumcised, then in the spirit of gender parity, then we should also cut off some clitorises. You know, you got to have 50-50 parity. This is a real person with a functioning brain who uttered those words. Now, I didn't bring here many of these examples, but for those of you who might be interested, you can go to my YouTube channel where I posted a talk that I gave at the Manning Conference in February in Ottawa. It was a talk on free speech on campus. And my whole talk was simply my reading testimonies that I've received from professors, from students, and in a few cases from parents of students. I removed everybody's identity, so you can't tell which school they went to, who they are, and so on. And I just read these because, for better or worse, I've become the central repository of everybody around the world who's being mistreated on some campus. And so people will write to me their stories. And they usually go something like, my lab director found out that I said something complimentary about Trump, and now he removed my name from the paper that I worked very hard on, and I could no longer be a member of the lab group. Hey, are you willing to take me on as a student, Dr. Saad? So this is happening not in North Korea, not in Yemen, not in Cuba, not in communist China under Mao Zedong. This is happening in Canada. This is happening in the US. So here's an example. This is a direct quote. Help, I'm a fourth-year student in a 5-year teaching program. I'll be heading to whatever next year for my 1 year of teacher's college. Only recently have I realized the radical left-wing messages embodied and embedded in virtually all of my classes, and I know it will only get worse at such and such school. What can I do about this? How do I stand up for the truth without risking my career as an elementary school teacher? Thank you. Now, anybody here who has any human dignity and human decency would actually feel for this person. Do we really want to live in a society where someone who is training to eventually teach our kids is too afraid to utter a single word lest she might lose her career? Is that a good thing? Is that the type of society we want? If yes, let's keep doing what we're doing. If no, then maybe you want to be supporting guys like me who are speaking out against this nonsense. Here's another one from a professor. As a fellow professor who has been frustrated by the discourse within academia on issues such as political correctness, moral relativism, and social justice, I'd like to thank you for speaking up the way you have from within academia. I see otherwise very reasonable and capable people abandoning reason and cowing to the narrative of the regressive left on many social issues. I receive 1 million of these emails, where professor after professor after professor in every conceivable field will write to me and say, I don't know how you have the courage to speak out. I'm afraid to utter a single syllable out of place because I'm going to lose my job. Is that a good thing? Do we want that? Or do we want to fight against that? You think my ideas are bad? Debate me. Put up a YouTube channel to say how I'm completely wrong. You don't shut me down. That's not the type of society we want to live in. That's the society that I escaped from in Lebanon 40 plus years ago. Here's some very bad news for Canadian universities. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms comes out with a yearly index of how free universities are in terms of how much do they support free expression on campus. And what they do basically is they look at the university policies and university practices and the student union policies and the student union practices, as stated in the relevant handbooks. And then they grade them, A, B, C, D, and F. Excuse me. They looked at 55 Canadian universities, so there are 55 Canadian universities on 4 scores. So there are 220 scores. So if Canada were perfectly free, we'd have 220 A's. If Canada were North Korea, we'd have 220 F's. Well, out of 220 possible grades, there were 8 A's. 8 A's out of 220 university scores. Is that a good thing? If you're a senior administrator in this room, are you proud of that? If you want to know how University of Regina scored, with all due sorries, you scored a C, F, D, and a C. But just to kind of make you feel better, my university scored a C, F, D, and an F, so you beat us. Okay? That's not good. But I can tell you here, and it doesn't matter that they are taping us, I've noticed that some senior administrators at my own university are, quote, distancing themselves from me. Even though 2 years ago I won the President's Award. Well, nothing's changed in what I'm talking about, but somehow I've become too controversial. I haven't. I'm only speaking what I consider to be the truth. If you think I'm wrong, prove it. This is identity politics on steroids. This is the march of science. The march of science should be about the message that I'm talking about here. We should all strive for an evidence-based society where reason and the scientific method rule our public policy, rule our debates, rule our exchange of ideas. But this is what the march of science had until eventually they brought it down. And they brought it down because guys like me and a few other very high-profile professors put light on what they had written. So let me read what they wrote before it was taken down. This is a group that's supposed to be supporting science. At the March for Science, we are committed to centralizing, highlighting, standing in solidarity with and acting as accomplices with Black, Latinx, Asian and Pacific Islanders, Indigenous, non-Christian. If you're Christian, sorry, buddy, you're out of luck. Women, people with disabilities, poor, gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, trans, non-binary, agender, and intersex scientists and science advocates, right? So this is what identity politics is. By the way, the distribution of prime numbers turns out to be exactly the same, whether the mathematician studying it is Latinx or non-gendered. Okay? That's why it's called science. It exists independently of the identity of the person conducting the research. Not to be outdone, I guess there goes my chance at a Canada Research Chair. The Canadian government decided that the highest professorship that could be bestowed in Canada will now no longer be based on the scientific and academic merit of people who apply. It will be based on whether you belong to certain groups. So if you happen to be 6'1", blonde with blue eyes, and you come originally from Sweden, sorry, buddy, you're out of luck. Okay? By the way, two of the groups that they really wanted to help out here were women and indigenous folks. Let's look at the narrative about how oppressed women are in universities. So here what I'll do is I won't rely on narratives, I'll use data. And then we could decide whether it's a very, very oppressive place to be a woman on campus. The Institute of Education Science, which is a US governmental organization, has aggregate data on the following. Now please follow carefully. The percent of university degrees awarded to women at all levels. There are 4 educational levels. In the US, you have something called an associate degree, which is like half a bachelor. So you have associate degree, you have bachelor's degree, you have master's degree, and you have doctorate. So there are 4 educational levels broken up into 5 racial groups: Black, White, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, and American Indian Alaskan Native. Okay? This is the data from the US government. So there are basically 20 cells, 4 educational levels by 5 races. So there are 20 cells. In each cell, we could look at what's the ratio of men to women who graduate within that cell. Do you follow? So if, let's say, I'm looking at black people, I could say black people PhD, how many black women obtain the PhD, how many black men obtain a PhD. For every single one, I could do that. Out of the 20 cells, now remember, we need to institute programs to really help out women because they are being horrifically abused in universities. Out of the 20 cells, how many of the cells did men outnumber women as the folks who graduated with that degree? Do you follow? And so in other words, if the narrative is correct, in 20 out of the 20 cells, men outnumber women. What were the actual data? Can somebody give me a guess? Somebody, just raise your hand. Oh, is it written? Bastards, cheaters. In 20 out of the 20 cells, are you listening? You awake? In 20 out of the 20 cells, across every educational level, across every racial group, women outnumber men in terms of graduating. Geez, I think we need to come up with new policies to help women out. So again, that doesn't mean that there isn't sexism. That doesn't mean that every woman in this room could probably not discuss some grotesque case of sexism. But if we're developing public policy, certainly if we're developing policy to grant professorships to the most deserving people, does the data suggest that women are having a rough time at a university? I would say we need to have the reverse type of program. Now, if you want Canadian data, 58% of students enrolled at Canadian medical schools are women. That's a hugely statistically significant effect. 58%, 13 out of 17 schools, women outnumber men. Geez, we got to find a way to help them out more. Let's look at other ways that we could look at that. Oh boy, we need some quotas there. Men's 100 Olympic champions since 1984. Here they are. What about fat Lebanese Jews who are... I mean, I don't see myself represented on the podium. I feel marginalized. What about overweight Lebanese guys? Why am I not winning the 100 meters? Well, maybe it's a competition. Oh boy, this is really looking like I need some quotas here. This is the winners of the Boston Marathon since 1991. Let me read you the countries just for effect. Kenya, 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 Kenya. Oh, South Korean bastard. Kenya, 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 Ethiopia, Kenya, 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 Ethiopia, Kenya, 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 Ethiopia. The United States guy is, by the way, from Eritrea. So that's still East Africa. Ethiopia, Ethiopia, Kenya. Why aren't the social justice warriors arguing that we need more diversity when it comes to the Boston Marathon? Where are the overweight Lebanese guys? No representation? So in a just society, we don't confuse equality of outcomes with equality of access. No one should be discriminated against to enter the game. But once you enter the game, if Messi is the best player and he wins every year, I can't argue, but what about, how come no transgender soccer players are winning best player of the year? They're being marginalized. Okay? Oh, Nobel Prizes. There's a big Jewish conspiracy. Jews make up 0.2% of the world's population, 15 million. Recently, I was on Joe Rogan, for those of you who know, and precisely because I wanted to prove that point, I said to him, hey, Joe, can you guess how many Jews there are in the world? Do you know what his first guess was? Anybody watch that episode?
500,000?
No, he said 1 billion. Joe, if I'm taping, I'm not making fun of you, buddy. I'm just making a point. He said 1 billion. 1 out of every 7 people is apparently Jewish. Then he downgraded it to, oh, maybe about 500 million. There are 15 million Jews in the world. 15 million in all the world. Yet, 20, 30% of Nobel Prizes go to Jews. That seems kind of unfair. We need more representation of other folks. What about people from Namibia? They're not winning. We need to have quotas for them. Okay? Quotas are an affront to human dignity. Okay? You compete in the game of life, and you win or you lose. Now, if there are institutionalized obstacles that don't allow you to play in the game, then I'm all with you. We need to fight that, and we need to set it straight. But we don't judge that by looking at the final result and say, oh, gee, I don't see myself on the podium at the 100 meters. We need to rig it. This is another thing that I'd like to talk very quickly about, the building of echo chambers. Universities have become astounding exercise of echo chambers. So if you look at, this is actually the gentleman who did this, Steve Hilton, came on my show recently. He used to be the former advisor of David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of Britain. They looked at across fields, across industries, what are the fields that are most leftist or on the right? Well, not surprisingly, the entertainment industry, the high-tech industry, academia, and the media were off the charts in being leftist. Okay? And they use a very, very formal, very nice quantitative algorithm to establish this. Now, that constitutes much of intelligentsia. Is it a good idea for everyone who is in intelligentsia to only be represented by one political aisle? It's not. Now, watch some other data I have for you. Here's some research by Cardiff and Klein. Klein is an economist at George Mason University who actually also came on my show, a lovely guy. They analyzed the political party affiliations of American professors at a whole bunch of American schools. The Democrat to Republican ratio across disciplines was 5-to-1. In other words, there were 5 times more Democrats than Republicans. Okay? Now, in some fields, like typically the social activism fields, the ratio was much, much higher than 5-to-1. So the worst one, in a lopsided sense, was sociology, 44-to-1. Now, do you think it's a good idea when you're dealing with topics such as fiscal policy, immigration policy, is the death penalty a good idea or not? People on both sides of the aisle could have very reasonable arguments for their position, right? It's not as though in science, is evolution true or not? Right? For many of these issues that we would learn in sociology or political science, there are really compelling arguments on both sides of the aisle. So if you're a student, do you not benefit from hearing about this panoply of possible positions? Well, apparently not, because everybody who is in those fields completely agree with one another. If you simply went to my personal Facebook page after Donald Trump won, you would literally think that the death squads are arriving any minute now. And my personal Facebook page is made up of a lot of academic friends of mine. And every single one of them was saying basically, is it safe for me to go to work tomorrow? Yeah, because they're going to set up roadblocks and they're going to check your tint of your skin, and depending on the color, they're going to send you to gang rape centers, right? I mean, for somebody who escaped Lebanese execution, that diminishes my personal history. When people can be so hysterical about, now that doesn't mean that I love Trump. That doesn't mean that I support Trump. What I'm criticizing is the reflex of this groupthink. Everybody who is in academia should say that Trump is a monster who's going to outlaw the raising of our children, and maybe he's going to eat them, right? But that's illogical. I mean, cut the hysteria out, right? So Thomas Sowell, who is someone I admire greatly, whom I tried to get on my show, but he's impossible to get to. I think at this point, he's maybe in his late 80s. He probably has no interest to speak to me. He said, I love this quote. He said, the next time some academics tell you how important diversity is, ask how many Republicans there are in their sociology department, right? So diversity is great when it comes to skin diversity, sexual orientation diversity, racial diversity, and so on. But the most important form of diversity, which is intellectual diversity, oh no, we can't have that at the university. We should all be the same. This is another study that's later, that came out by Klein and his friends. Again, look at the scores. The total is 11.5 to 1, Democrats to Republicans. That's not good, especially in ideological fields. By the way, in engineering and in neuroscience, you don't get this lopsided thing, because those folks deal with real things. You either have the physics to build the bridge so it withstands the forces at hand, or you don't. But in other fields that are laden with political activism, that's where you get the really lopsided ratios, and that's not a good thing. It's not healthy. We need to defeat that. If you're wondering about what happens in Canada, it's very similar. 40% of professors voted for the Liberal Party, about 4 times more than for the Conservative Party, and about 25% of professors view themselves as left-leaning, which is about 5 times more than right-leaning. So again, in Canada, we have about a 5-to-1 ratio in terms of our political partisanship. So what do we conclude from all this? Freedom of speech is everything. Look, I spoke here. You were all lovely. Thank you for not interrupting me and whistling and so on. Some of you might have loved what I said. Others didn't care for it. So you take it and throw it in the garbage, right? But at least you were courteous enough to allow me to air my ideas. And I thank you for that. So all the forces that are leading us to the abyss of infinite darkness must be dismantled. What does that mean? No more language police. No speech codes. Dismantle them. No more thought police via the shackles of political correctness. No more echo chambers that shun intellectual diversity. No more identity politics. Instead, promote the dignity of the individual rather than supporting oppression Olympics and victimology poker. Okay? I am an individual. I'm not a Lebanese Jew. I'm first Gad Saad, with all my qualities and all my faults. So honor the individual, not whatever tribe you wish to belong to. No more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. No microaggressions, no trigger warnings, no safe spaces, no cultural appropriation. Do not cede a single inch to any ideology that is antithetical to our secular, modern, and liberal. And here I earlier talked about this at dinner. I don't mean faux liberal. I mean true liberal, classical liberal values. All ideas, all beliefs, all ideologies are open to criticism, to debate, to mocking, to ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny. Short of direct incitement to violence, eradicate hate speech laws. And as I said earlier in the talk, I support the right of Holocaust deniers to deny the Holocaust, and I'm Jewish. It's almost impossible to imagine something more grotesque and more of an affront to the truth, and yet I support their right to be grotesque, to be monstrous idiots. That's the price you pay to live in a free society. Some people are jerks, and we need to tolerate them. But if somebody says, let's kill all Jews, well then you've gone into incitement to violence. That can't be allowed. Short of that, freedom of speech should be an absolutist thing. So science, reason, and logic trump ideology and feelings. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. Dr. Saad has agreed to entertain some questions. There are microphones in the aisles on both sides here. If you have a question, please come to the microphone. But I will ask you to be brief because I expect quite a few questions and we are limited. So please come to the microphone and ask your question. Yes.
Hello, Dr. Saad. My name is Robert. I'm a librarian here at the university. I just had a question for you. One of my colleagues in the Faculty of Arts, who will go unnamed, sent around an email today saying that you're giving an alt-right speech, and I feel sort of disappointed because although there's a lot of MAGA hats here, it just didn't live up to my expectations.
You thought I'd be much more of a Nazi, didn't you?
Yeah, I was hoping, but just,
sorry to disappoint you.
But I was wondering, what part do you see labeling playing in political correctness, and how can we oppose this sort of labeling that people use to silence debate? Thank you.
Thank you. Often people ask me, how can I get engaged? How can I contribute to this battle of ideas, to kind of generalize your question? And there is really no magical recipe other than get engaged. The battle of ideas is fought in the trenches. It happens with your Facebook friends. It happens when you chat later today at the bar. It happens in the classroom when your professor says something that you disagree with. There is no reason why you can't challenge people respectfully, nicely, politely, but challenge them if you think they're saying something wrong. The problem is that now we've lost that reflex of debates. And so most of us don't want to rock the boat, so we keep quiet. Challenge. And if enough people rise up, the domino effect will be very quick. It doesn't take much, just like the Soviet Union collapsed very quickly. We reached the tipping point and then poof, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. By the same logic, we can defeat this monster if we each contribute to the battle of ideas. It's as simple as that.
We will take turns, I think.
Hi, I'm a third-year student of international studies, and I firmly believe in freedom of speech. And when I normally discuss, say, Islam or Christianity and beg to disagree with some of what's written in each of those languages, it just seems I'm branded intolerant. I'm just looked down upon as someone who's completely against their religion. And then my question is, I have encountered this for quite some time now. And it burdens you at some point. You know deep down that I have nothing against Christianity, nor do I have anything against Islam. I'm an atheist myself. So how do you really, as a student or as a grad student, go ahead and live facing this daily thinking where people look down upon you as someone that you're not? How do you overcome that feeling?
Do you want me to send you the number of ways people have suggested they should exterminate me? Boiled alive, skinned, you're a good kike, that's why you're the last guy we will gas, because I like you, electric, and on and on. So when you are engaging in war, if I can use the metaphor, you don't go to war to fight for freedom and say, but I'd like to be given the guarantee that I won't get harmed. By the exact same logic, when you're fighting the battle of ideas, you're going to get harmed at some points. People will call you things, people will attack you, so there will be, quote, an injury to your personhood. That's a fact, and so you simply have to have the sufficiently strong courage to withstand that. There's no other recipe, because you will be attacked, as I am when people call me a Jewish Nazi.
Thank you.
Yeah, I came here to support you regarding free speech. My question is regarding your YouTube channel. How have you been affected by the demonetization and the censoring of YouTube in terms of free speech? Some of these alternative media folks like yourself who are promoting this stuff.
Right.
Because some of them have lost 90% of their revenues and.
Right. So just to kind of summarize what he said, so when you have a YouTube channel, you could monetize your content so that you can get ad revenue. And what's been happening recently to a lot of content creators is that nearly all of their backlog is getting demonetized. I mean, the good news is that we still have the platform, so my ideas can still get out. The bad news is you no longer can get the same remuneration for your time.
Are some of your videos being totally...
Not deleted, no.
Deleted?
Because,
like some
I've never had any, no. And frankly, I think because I do speak in a very measured, very factual base. But I could tell you that sometimes I've put up recently clips that I've posted, in other words, they're not even publicly released yet, and I already receive an alert from YouTube that they are demonetizing it before it even goes public. Yeah. So I don't know if I am specifically being targeted or whether there is sort of a hyperactive algorithm that's stopping everything that has certain keywords, but it is disheartening because ultimately it'll be nice to be remunerated for your time. I mean, a lot of us don't make a lot of money on this, and I don't do it for the money, but whatever little money I make, it'll be nice to have.
In addition to, what are your thoughts with regard to propaganda, mainstream media, basically lying by omission, keeping a lot of, not reporting on certain,
You're saying
bits of information, yeah.
What do I think of the media in general?
Yeah, the media, the mainstream media.
Well, I mean, I guess it's here, right? Where is it? If you look here, this one, right? It's incredibly, this is a very quantitative algorithm. So the media, both on the left and the right, is very polarized. If you watch Fox, you hear one narrative. If you watch MSNBC, you hear another narrative. I suggest you try to look outside of these media.
But that's the alternative media, which is being censored.
I'll give you an example. This is a shout out to a good friend of mine. For example, many of you may not like him or others do. Someone like the Rubin Report is a guy who brings in people who are reasonable on both sides of the aisle. So I think one of the beautiful things about all these tools that we now have available, a lot of us can have a huge platform and bypass the media. And so look for these types of voices.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's long enough.
Cheers.
Forgive me for reading, but I've got a big pull quote here. In the 2015-2020 strategic plan, the University of Regina embedded the concept of indigenization as an area of emphasis. They defined this as the transformation of the existing academy by including indigenous knowledges, voices, critiques, scholars, students, and materials, as well as to facilitate the ethical stewardship of plurality of indigenous knowledges and practices so thoroughly as to constitute an essential element of the university. Large pull quote. So just in regards to this comment, and I guess some of the issues you've brought up, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the university's area of emphasis on this.
I mean, I don't know anything about it other than what you just read. Look, if there is a group of folks whose history has been unduly ignored, and if the matter of record is to correct that, then I'm all for that. Great, because it simply creates a more accurate reading of whatever contribution those folks have made and so on. Great. But again, my concern is simply commitment to truth, right? So for example, I wouldn't hire a number theorist, which is a field of pure mathematics, as a function of whether they are indigenous or Lebanese Jewish. Because number theory exists in all its beauty independently of the identity of the person. So what I'm arguing is not so much that we shouldn't honor indigenous culture, is that we shouldn't be choosing the highest professorships to be bestowed on people based on their identities. That's an affront to human dignity.
So in terms of honoring like indigenous knowledges, scholars and such, generally, as you mentioned in a slide, the history of indigenous knowledge is through oral tradition. So by taking on this strategic plan, it seems like a movement towards perhaps honoring that oral tradition. Do you think, I guess you already sort of said, so you would say you are not for that?
If it is in the specific context of when you are evaluating a professor's tenure dossier, then you have to write. I mean, right? So in other words, Jewish tradition, the Jewish faith was originally passed through oral tradition before it was written. So how come all the Jews who have won the Nobel Prize didn't say, wow, but I can't do this Nobel Prize bullshit. I mean, I come from an oral tradition, right? So nobody is saying, let's not honor your oral tradition, but you can't game the system. You can't go up for tenure. I mean, let's look at each other honestly. You have somebody who spent 11 years or however many years she spent publishing nothing. And then she finds that there is a way for her to game the system, which is, oh, by the way, oral tradition, I'm not expected. And then because people want to be kind and tolerant and so on, they say, okay, don't game the system. So we could still honor the indigenous oral tradition while recognizing. As a matter of fact, I would say it is racist to expect folks from that background to not hold them to the same standards as everybody else. That's, by the way, is called the soft bigotry of low expectations. Right? We're all equal. You don't get a pass because you come from oral tradition, because I also come from an oral tradition. I'm Jewish.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a math student at U of R, and well, I guess I'm just curious about these kinds of issues. You mentioned the case with John Money, John Money and his study of, well, his experiment, I guess, with David Reimer. And in reading this, well, since this is kind of your field, biology and psychology and that relationship, is there anybody before him that believed in that idea of gender? Because like I notice the further you go back, it's more so that idea of the binary, and gender wasn't really, like, I read that he coined the term gender. Before him, it was just biological sex.
So I'll answer it in a more general way. A lot of social scientists have systematically sought to remove biology as being relevant to social affairs. So cultural anthropologists try to argue that there are no human universals. Everything is culture specific. And the reason why people did that is because they thought that biological knowledge can lead to nefarious consequences. So all sorts of folks misused Darwinian theory. Take, for example, the Nazis, right? They said, hey, there's a natural struggle between the races. We're the Aryans, we won. The Jews have lost. What's wrong with getting rid of them? That's Darwinian. Of course, it had nothing to do with Darwinian theory. But because all sorts of really cretinous people misused evolutionary theory, social scientists came along and said, let's construct a new narrative that will hopefully eradicate the possibility of people misusing scientific knowledge. And so the blank slate premise comes from that. The gender movement comes from that. The we're all culture specific comes from that. So that's wrong. You should, if you're an academic, you should pursue the truth unencumbered by the downstream effects. I was recently, well, a few months, almost a year ago now, on Sam Harris's show. Some of you may know who Sam Harris is. And he asked me, do you in your own work have any research that you would not be willing to do? Which I answered, so you're saying basically, is there any forbidden knowledge? And I answered, absolutely not. If a scientist pursues a research question honestly and in an unbiased manner, then all bets are off. You could pursue anything. Because then it becomes very easy to say, oh, but don't do sex differences. Don't do race differences. Don't do this, don't do that. So I can't tell you who was the first person to, say the word gender, but I can tell you that it is a rejection of biology and human nature, and it's wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last week, Chelsea Manning was was appointed as a fellow at Harvard, and because of controversy, was very quickly disinvited. I guess just for me, following through your presentation, I feel like it brought a lot of really rational and logical points to why, limiting Chelsea's space to engage and speak with students was stifling of free speech and political correctness. And I'm just, I guess, wondering what your thoughts are.
So I very vaguely heard of it, but I haven't followed the specifics of what they said to offer an intelligent, if you send me an email, I'm willing to offer you a more intelligent response, but I don't know enough the details of what Harvard said to give you a confident answer.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Bart. I'm going to ask you a question, and it's going to kind of ask you to accept something as true that you might want to reject out of hand, and that's fine. What if, in the search for truth, you find something that is morally repugnant? In the sense of, what if people like you or people like me are genuinely bad for society, and that by removing people like me or people like you, you can, by every measure, improve society?
So that's sort of a hypothetical philosophical discussion. Can you give me an example in terms of scientific knowledge that would fit under that rubric?
Sure. Let's go with statistically, if you have single-parent households, the children by pretty much every measure fail compared to people with two-parent households. So scientifically, we should try and do whatever we can to limit or denigrate single-parent households to ensure that more people don't engage in having single-parent households.
See, thank you for that example. I would look at that as in a different way. To the extent that we want to have public policy that is maximally effective, then we should try to the best of our ability, understand the true explanations for that phenomenon. So I'll give you an example that might get some people riled up here. A few years ago, two colleagues of mine, one of whom I know quite well, wrote a book that required them to have police escort. It was a book looking at rape from an evolutionary perspective. Now, most people thought that they were trying to justify or condone rape by offering a scientific and evolutionary explanation. Of course, that's not what they were doing at all. What they were saying is there are evolutionary reasons why men are likely to engage in particular patterns of rape. And if we're going to eradicate rape or reduce rape, we better have a good understanding of it. So they were actually coming from a very noble place. They wanted to better understand rape. What the social activists heard is no, these scientists are trying to come up with scientific reasons to justify rape. So you see how the wires are crossed? So my answer is, look, as long as you are doing something honestly to better understand the human condition, go for it. I'll give you a very good example of this dilemma. Some of you may know Philip Rushton. Philip Rushton was a guy who became infamous and highly controversial for studying race differences, specifically IQ differences in race. I'll tell you a very quick story. When I was a young assistant professor, I think maybe 1996, so 2 years out of my PhD, I was speaking at the International Congress of Psychology, and the room was packed, maybe 1,500 people, and there seemed to be tension in the room. And usually I'm not at all nervous when I'm about to go speak, but there I felt really nervous, not knowing that the guy who was going to speak immediately before me was Philip Rushton. And he was going to put up slides about the brains of white people and black people and white. And as he was putting up those slides, I was saying, oh my God, I'm going to be lynched by proxy just because I'm going to share the same stage. Now, the good news for me is that when he finished his talk, out of the 1,500 people, about 1,425 left to lynch him. And only about 75 stayed for me. And I was like, thank God. But even in his case, some people have said he had a racist agenda, whereas other people that I've spoken to who knew him said he had zero racism in him. He just wanted to understand whether these racial differences exist. So I'm really an absolutist. If you are pursuing the scientific method honestly in an unbiased manner, all bets are off. Go for it.
Okay, and I do apologize. I'll ask one quick follow-up.
Sure.
So if he's right, and the research that he did honestly and did in every intentional scientific way is properly done, and people of color or black people have less or lower IQs than white people, what do you do with that? Like, what do you do once you have the truth? How do you spin that into something useful?
So I'm going to answer this in a way that you might not necessarily like, but Fermat, or in French we say Fermat, the mathematician, was someone, recently, actually, a few years ago, Fermat's last theorem was solved. For hundreds of years, Fermat did proofs that lay dormant with zero practicality until we then had cryptography, computer security, and some of these theorems that had zero value suddenly became valuable. So the way that I would answer you, not that I'm trying to dodge the question, I'm a purist. I do research just to better understand the world. What someone does with that research is someone else's job. I just study human nature and I don't care where it goes.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a question about something you brought up on your appearance on Joe Rogan, and I apologize if I misquote you because I don't have it in front of me, but you talked a lot about kind of the rise of Islam in the West in places like Egypt and Turkey and Syria, and how give 150 years, we could see a very similar thing here in Canada and the United States. And just kind of from all of my academic experience and knowledge, it kind of seems that radical terrorism and kind of what you explain to be political Islam is moving more to kind of an online realm more so than a physical place. So that being the case, do you think that it actually is possible that a situation like that might arise in, say, 150 years here?
You mean that our societies might become more Islamized?
Yeah.
It's a demographic game, right? As I explained on Joe Rogan, in some cases, the ideology comes in and 5 minutes later it's Islamized. Some cases it's 50 years, some cases it's 500 years, some cases it never happens. So the reality though is that there are demographic, right? There's a quote, I hope I don't offend anyone here. A lot of Islamic theorists said, I mean, you could just go on YouTube and see them saying it. They said, we are going to conquer the West not through violence, we're going to conquer it in 3 ways. We're going to conquer it through hijrah, which means immigration in Arabic, as Muhammad immigrated from Mecca to Medina. We're going to conquer the West through the womb of our women, that's demography. And we're going to conquer the West by using your miserable freedoms against you. That's not me saying it. That's he's saying it. So if maybe he's an Islamophobe, okay? So I'm just repeating what those folks are saying. If you enter in certain countries, what is the rate of fertility for the indigenous society, which is below replacement, right? 2.1 is replacement. And then you look at what might be the fertility rate of some of those other groups. Well, it just takes a very simple demographic calculation to say, well, when does it flip? Now, it might be a great idea for our societies to be Islamized. If that's the case, then great, let's do it. But if not, then let's talk about it. But either case, we should be allowed to speak about it openly and honestly. Look, when I escaped Lebanon, Muslims were going to kill us, and Muslims are the ones who saved us, right? So there are very nice Jews and very mean Jews. There are very nice Muslims and very mean. So nothing in whatever I ever say attacks individual people, because nobody knows more Muslims than I do. I grew up in that society, right? 99% of all Muslims I've ever met have been lovely. They've been colleagues, they've been students, they've been friends. That doesn't mean, though, that there aren't specific elements within Islam that might be incongruent with the West. Then let's fix those, and then let's all live happily together.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. I just wanted to address something that's somewhat of a little bit of a contradiction. Like in your first answer, you had said that the way to kind of combat this is to kind of, fight with the truth and that kind of thing. And then, I've been kind of listening to Dr. Peterson a little bit, and he kind of takes a little bit of a different tack in that you can't fight with truth because it's like you're playing like their game, and they're better than you are at it, though, or better. Do you know what I mean? And so, in other words, you go and you try and speak truth, and you just get shouted down. Like, for instance, you go and you have a lecture. Your lecture at Ryerson was shut down. I mean, we're a bit more sensible here in Saskatchewan than you guys are out east, though, so it didn't get shut down. But but it's not a tenable solution. Even on the slide that you had where it said 17 out of 20 of the people in medical school are women, and they're still claiming that but women are being discriminated against, which they may or may not be. But again, that's sort of a contradiction in that, I mean, you have tenure, so you can go and say that kind of thing. But for the average person who's trying to fight against that, they're going to get shouted down, they're going to lose their job. And so, how do you kind of address that contradiction?
But again, that speaks to the question that the gentleman said earlier about what can you do if you're going.
Well, that's the question that I was referring to.
Okay. So let me answer you. Do you not? Sorry. Go ahead. Did you finish?
No, I'm done.
Okay. Do you not think that I bear a great cost for what I do? Do you think it's all roses for me?
No.
Do you know how many professorships I know for a fact I would have gotten were it not for some faculty member standing up and shutting it down? Do you know that now I have to walk around in some places with security and the police is alerted because I walk there? So do you don't think I take huge risks for what I do?
No, but that wasn't my question. My question was that, what is a tenable solution to this? In your opinion,
what is solution?
What is a good solution to?
Just get engaged. There's no other recipe. You might be shouted down. You might lose your job. You can't go to war and not expect to have some casualties. So, a million people write to me and say, look, I really want to contribute to the battle of ideas, but I don't want to speak because my girlfriend won't like me, and I don't want to speak because my friends won't like me, and I don't want to say anything on Facebook because they'll downvote me, and I don't want to say, well, then get out of my face. I mean, how can I help you then? How can you contribute to the battle of ideas while listing 17 reasons why you're too scared to battle it? I bear that burden every day. My life is a living stress ball because I get emails that say how we're going to skin you. Yet I still do it. Why? Because I'm sufficiently confident in the importance of fighting for truth. So do it. Don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, we will take one more question and I have to conclude because we are running out of time. One more.
Thank you. My question actually directly pertains to the slide that's on the screen right now. You talk a little bit about echo chambers and how the left and the right have both created their own echo chambers. My question to you is whether or not you believe that there's also the development of intellectual echo chambers within oneself. And so the example that pops into my mind is, as I watched your presentation, you gave detailed citations of things that supported your perspectives. And then you offered much vaguer sort of descriptions of things that contradicted you or things that you were criticizing. And I felt as though in certain cases you built a straw man to attack. The example that pops into my mind is the Bill Nye example where you said he claimed solar panels caused terrorism. I saw that interview. He was talking about how climate change had changed social and economic conditions in the countries where that terrorism was originating from. And so I suppose it's less of a question and more of me seeking a response from you, in that you seem to have, at least to some extent within your own presentation, created an intellectual echo chamber around your own perspective. How do you respond to
that? No.
Well,
you're
maybe
wrong.
A little more than a no.
Okay, so let's take the Bill Nye. Bill Nye said this: there is a drought in Syria. That drought caused crop failure. That crop failure caused prices to go up, forcing a lot of people to stop farming, forcing them to go into the cities. By them going into the cities, it created density and crowding. That increased tension. That resulted in part, that conflict.
That's exactly right. But
yeah.
you
so,
said...
gee, do I know the argument of Bill
yes,
Nye?
but I believe that you know it.
Yeah.
But you just said, Bill Nye said solar panels cause terrorism.
Because he actually referred to them in his Huffington Post Live with Josh Zepps, who was a guy on my show. Go to the thing. He referred to solar panels.
Okay, so I fully believe that you entirely understand Bill Nye's point. It wasn't a tremendously complicated point. But what I'm getting at is I'm concerned that in the way that you framed a number of these arguments, you have sort of insulated your own perspective.
I can't be insulated. I'll tell you why. Because I'm incredibly public. So what that means basically, if I am wrong, believe me, people come after me. Okay? In other words, there's a very, very clear mechanism by which people keep me honest, which is There are 10,000 comments on my Facebook page, on my YouTube. So there is an autocorrective mechanism by which if people, that's what it means to engage in the public, right? So if I'm wrong, great, then prove me wrong. Go to my YouTube channel or put your own YouTube clip and prove me wrong. So no, I don't think I'm succumbing to my own echo chamber because I share my ideas with people, and believe me, they weigh in on whether I'm right or wrong. So how could that be an echo chamber? I'm exposing myself to the world.
Well, I appreciate your response.
Cheers.
I would like to thank you all for attending tonight's lecture. And of course, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Gad Saad, for this thoughtful and thought-provoking lecture. And I am glad everyone behaved themselves and engaged in a respectful debate. And there are some refreshments outside. Please join us in the hallway outside. And thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.